Welcome back to the channel. It's your favorite reactor, Senpai Reacts, and we got another fire video. Waiting a long time to do this video. I keep putting it off, doing other stuff, but ever since I did my K-pop in public video and this song was in the video, I knew immediately that I needed to react to the music video. I don't heard the song before, like in the video, but we're gonna listen. We're gonna we're gonna watch the music video and we're gonna react to it. Cause that's what I'm here for. That's what I do. I react to stuff. Yeah, that's my job here.
이번 발사는 하나의 발사체에 6개의 위성을 실어보내는 것으로 실패할 가능성도 배제할 수는 없습니다. 하지만 실패하더라도 다음 발사 시도의 성공률을 높일 수 있는 데이터를 얻을 수 있을 만큼 유의미한 실험이라고 봅니다. 고로 설명드립니다. 위자드가 무사히 지구에 도착할 경우 하루에 15바퀴 지구를
어떡해.
돌며 12월까지 탐사와 천체 관측,
I thought he started throwing like holy water or something at the phone. Hold on, wait till that beat drop. Hold on.
1, 2, let's go. Back in my heart, that girl's a killer. Love so good, feels like a thriller. Even emergency. 119, 119. Save my life, save my life. She sets me free. 이건 emergency love. 너는 마치 flashlight. 자꾸만 시선을 뺏겨. 많은 사람 속에서 순간 너만 보였어. 다들 말하지 love is so sweet. 와, so sweet. 아직 난 뭔지 모르겠지 right now. 처음 느낀 이상한 떨림. 이건 진심만 나기를. 친구이기엔 더 deeper deeper deeper. 어쩌면 love song yeah. Love song yeah. Back in my heart that girl's a killer. Love so good feels like a thriller. Even emergency. 119, 119. Save my life, save my life. She sets me free. 이건 emergency love. 이상해 나와 do I do. 너에 관한 건 뭐라도. 신경 쓰여 난 all day. 너만 들어 my day. 이 감정은 someday 난 알고 싶어. 네가 이룰 love is so sweet. 와, so sweet. 멈출 수 없이 빠져버린 나야. 네가 자꾸 궁금해 왜지 말도 안 돼 I'm not kidding. 시간이 갈수록 깊어 깊어 깊어져가는 나잖아. Back in my heart that girl's a killer. Love so good feels like a thriller. 이건 emergency. 119, 119. Save my life, save my life. She sets me free. 이건 emergency love.
Oh man, that beat transition is so smooth. It's so good. Like I can't explain how much I love this song. I can't put it into words. The excitement or hype I was when I watched the K-pop in public video, the dance video. Make sure you go check it out on my channel. Cause I wasn't expecting the song. Cause I just pick a random video, so I wasn't expecting the song in that video to be that good. But then it was just. I was just blown away because I don't know much about this group. This is like the first song I ever heard from this group. So it was just imagine the first time you hear a song from a group that's I don't did like a lot of K-pop groups on my channel, right? But like just certain songs that's like really, just really hit it home for you. Let's go back to the beat transition.
시간이 갈수록 깊어 깊어 깊어져가는 나잖아. Back in my heart that girl's a killer. Love so good feels like a thriller. 이건 emergency. 119, 119. Save my life, save my life. She sets me free. 이건 emergency love.
번째
arrive at
발사체가
Kuragome
오늘
Station.
새벽 추락했습니다. 담당 연구원들은 발사 실험의 성공에만 집중했습니다.
Find your love.
Yeah, 이건 뭘까? You know what I'm talking about. 왜 이렇게 나의 마음이 어지러운 걸까? 이 모든 게 내가
School
널
field trip?
좋아하는 건가? 난 그럼 더 이상 끌고 싶지 않아. 다른 건 nothing but a funny road with you. Making my heart that girl so cute. Love so good, feels like a dream. 이건 emergency. One night, save my life, save my life. She sets me free. 이건 emergency love.
Snow day. Love 119. If you're in America, then it's like Love 911. If you didn't catch that, I probably didn't need to explain that. But yeah, I don't. What's like Rizzy? I can't pronounce that. There's a Japanese version, but I mean, I said it like I can really understand some Japanese. I don't know why I got excited about that. But yeah, if you do, make sure you subscribe. I really love the song. Make sure you like, comment, vote, any video suggestions you have. Follow all my socials in the description, TikTok, Twitter. Follow me there, and I'll see you guys in the next reaction.